In this MTG Foundations Draft Meta update, I'll be providing you with the most up-to-date info on the format so you can crush your next draft. First up, the format news. And our first headline, Classic Magic returns. There are a ton of iconic Magic the Gathering cards from the history of the game in this set. Staples like Overrun, Sarah Angel, and even Shivan Dragon making their return in this set. And while a lot of these cards are a little bit past their prime or not as good as they once were, they are still totally playable cards to even good cards in some cases, and they are the sort of thing that makes this set feel very iconic and nostalgic for players that are returning, or a really nice on-ramp onto the game if you are a newer player. The archetypes are relatively straightforward and iconic of the color pairs that they represent. The cards play out more simply than in a lot of sets. There's not a ton of complex mechanics running around, and overall the set feels really nice to play and is a breath of fresh air for Magic players who don't always love it when the game is too complicated, or if they just want to play a Magic experience that feels very much so like the Magic of old. So this is a set that you will enjoy if you're a returning player that are looking for something that reminds you of Magic that you played a long time ago, or a new player that are really trying to get into Magic and learn with a really nice set that is really straightforward to get into. So Classic Magic coming back is really, really good for the game. Next, one drops are back. As part of this return, there are a lot of iconic or just solid one drops that have been printed in the past, or even a couple of new ones. Healer's Hawk, a really nice evasive flyer that has some life gain attached, so has some synergies there. Llanowar Elves is absolutely iconic as the 1-mana green creature that ramps your draw and accelerates you out to your bigger threats. And even cards like Fanatical Firebrand, which aren't on quite the same power level as Healer's Hawk or Llanowar Elves, are in this set and are certainly playable partially as a way to kill your opponent's 1-drops. So that's something to keep in mind, that 1-drops are back to being playable and they feel pretty solid to have in your decks. Next, Flood Insurance for sale. This set actually doesn't have a ton of mana sinks in the format. There aren't mechanics built in that let you have extra ways to spend your mana like we have sometimes seen in previous sets, so you have to be very conscious of how you're going to spend your mana in the late game. A card like Icewind Elemental that draws you a card and discards a card lets you get rid of extra lands and actually performs pretty solidly. Dreadwing Scavenger is the king of this because it lets you draw a card and discard a card when it enters play or when it attacks, which is really good. And then even cards like Squad Rallier that maybe don't look as impressive, 4-mana 3/4, do a little bit better in this format because having the ability to spend 3 mana to like potentially dig through your deck and get some extra resources in that late game is very relevant. So keep an eye out for these Flood Insurance cards, especially if your deck is planning on going to the late game. Moving on to the meta market and kicking things off with the archetype rankings. At number 1 is Blue-White Flyers, a classic archetype that performs really well here thanks to, quite frankly, good card quality. There are good flyers in high enough quantities to make the deck work. It doesn't really overly rely on synergy, so even if you're missing 1 or 2 pieces, the deck is still going to come together. You want to have your flying creatures and ways to stall the game, and there are plenty of those tools in this format, so you're going to be able to pull this deck together, and it does perform quite well, while also being simple to put together. Next is Black-White Life Gain. This is a little bit more of a complex deck than Blue-White Flyers because you need multiple pieces to come together. You need cards that gain you life and also need cards that reward you for gaining life. But there are plenty of copies of cards that perform both roles, and this archetype is really powerful when it does come together. So it's a little bit more finicky than the Flyers archetype, but when you can assemble those pieces, it really is quite strong and draws on high card quality from white and black. Next is Black-Red Raid Sacrifice. It doesn't have to be a raid deck and a sacrifice, raid of course being a mechanic that rewards you for attacking, but it can kind of play a lot of different roles. You don't have to overly index onto the sacrifice part either. You can play high card quality, good removal spells, solid creatures, get some value from that, and overall take over the game in that way. Or you can be a more aggressively slanted deck that attacks your opponent and puts pressure on them with raid triggers. So there's a lot of different angles you can go with Black-Red, but the cards do slot together nicely, pairing the black removal spells with the red aggression and things like that. Next is Red-Green Stompy. This archetype can really snowball out of control quickly thanks to Llanowar Elves ramping out big threats in the early turns and destroying your opponent before they have a chance to recover. So this archetype really takes advantage of the ramp tools in green, of the Llanowar Elves specifically, because it wants to end the game in a hurry. And Llanowar Elves is really at its best in these strategies, and that's why this archetype is number 1 in the green ones, because when you have an early 1-drop that can accelerate your mana, then you're wanting to end the game before that kind of catches up to you, before the Llanowar Elves becomes a mid-game top deck that's just basically like drawing another land. You want to really take advantage of the mana acceleration in green and the aggressive tools of red, combined with big creatures of green to finish the game. Next is blue-black control. This is a really nice control deck in this format because it has some really nice filtering tools for the late game to make sure you can actually get rid of your extra lands while your opponent is potentially flooding out in those mid-game turns. And so this strategy really does thrive in those late game situations compared to the typical deck because you're able to make sure you have a well-stocked hand while your opponent is running out of gas. And that's the key to control decks. Next is red-white aggro, the opposite end of the spectrum, able to apply early pressure to your opponents, really fill the board with creatures, buff those creatures up, and attack with huge swings as options. And that's really what red-white aggro is all about in this format. It's a really straightforward archetype. You don't really want to go to the late game that much with this deck, though, because you're not going to be able to hang with the other decks that are potentially doing something more powerful or gaining life or being able to get rid of their extra lands more effectively. But in the early turns, you can be quite powerful. Next is green-white +1/+1 counters. This archetype is again a little bit more finicky as an aggressive deck, but can definitely get the job done. There are some really good cards that put +1/+1 counters on creatures. There's less cards that give you direct rewards for +1/+1 counters, but those things just help you push aggression. They help you attack your opponent, and there are some really good cards in this archetype that are going to help you make a big board that has large creatures because of the +1/+1 counters, while also going a little bit wide by having cards that let you put counters on multiple creatures or things like that. Next is blue-red spells. This is an archetype that cares about casting instants and sorceries. Again, a little bit more finicky because you do need to have that nice mix of cards that care about casting instants and sorceries, and also the instants and sorceries themselves, particularly the ones that draw you cards to replace themselves, so you can start flooding the game by casting a lot of them in one turn, or just consistently casting them turn over turn. And blue-red spells is definitely the sort of archetype that can be really powerful when it comes together, but missing a couple synergy pieces sometimes can doom you, unlike some of the other strategies where they're a little bit more straightforward, which is why it comes in a little bit lower on the rankings. Next is blue-green ramp. This deck just struggles a little bit from a lack of quality interaction that can kill your opponent's creatures dead, and also the fact that there are some decks that can really compete with it in the late game, or the fact that the ramping payoffs aren't necessarily as high as they could have been in other sets. So ramp, definitely a strategy you can play if you get some good top-end stuff, but it's not like the craziest strategy to be playing in this format. And then finally, black-green morbid value. This is a deck that cares about having creatures die. It tries to grind out opponents. Sometimes that can be a liability if you don't actually get the late game tools to win, or you have those finicky situations where you aren't able to kill creatures consistently to trigger your morbid creatures. That can also be a problem. So keep an eye out for ways to sacrifice your own creatures to trigger morbid. That can be a nice little way to do that, but also just make sure you have the late game on lock if you're going to try to play these more slow grindy decks. Looking at the color rankings, coming in first is white. White has really good quality commons across the board. It just has such a deep roster of commons that you're happy to play, and a lot of them are really powerful. It has good uncommons, it has good pairings with the other colors, and overall white is just a really strong color in this format. Black comes in next. It has really premium removal, which is what black often shines at in limited, and it also has some nice little synergy packages that you can assemble depending on your archetype. It has some pretty good late game packages for your blue-black control decks. It has some sacrifice packages for your red-black decks, and overall there are a bunch of different black cards that kind of slot nicely into different homes in this format, and so it's a nice color to be playing. Blue comes in next. It has really good advantage in the late game situations where you're going to be able to get rid of extra lands and also be able to draw extra cards to win those late games. And this is a little bit of a slower format, so you're able to leverage those extra cards that blue is able to provide for you, while also not worrying as much about the early turns where blue can stumble. It doesn't have the best removal directly, so that is a bit of a weakness for the color, but pairing it with better removal colors like white or black can also really do good work. And next up is red, which also has pretty medium removal. It has one really premium removal spell in Burst Lightning, but other than that, the removal is medium in red, but it does have some reasonable card quality, especially at uncommon. It's got decent commons. It's got like an aggressive strategy, which means that all of the red cards kind of work towards the same cohesive game plan, but it is a little bit on the weaker end in terms of depth of cards because there are some clunkers in red, and like the 4th or 5th or 6th best commons in red are not necessarily on par with the 4th or 5th or 6th best commons in white or black or things like that. And then coming in last is green. It doesn't really have huge standouts, and that's part of the problem with the color, is that it just has a bunch of mediocre things, and some of the cards are not very good. So instead of ranging from good to bad, it kind of ranges from medium plus to bad in a lot of the metrics that you would care about, like good commons, good uncommons, things like that. It does have some nice color pairs, as we already talked about. Red, green, even though it's the two worst colors on this ranking, is actually a strategy that can be very effective because it does the best things of what red and green are both doing. but a lot of the times you'd rather be playing a different color than green. That being said, it's always important to note that with color rankings, it's more important to draft the open colors than it is to avoid a color or to force a color based on a ranking, because if you are in a color that's very open, you will be getting all of the premium cards and will still be able to crush your opponents. So don't hard avoid a color and don't hard force a color. Just maybe use this as a tiebreaker for close picks. Next up is the format speed, and I would classify this as a slower format. There are a lot of games that come down to top deck battles and who is going to be able to get rid of extra lands in the mid to late game or just draw more cards or have some sort of value engine established. There are some fast games, there are some quick games, of course, but I would say that this is a slower format. There are times to develop your game plan, and there are a lot of battles where it comes down to who can more effectively use their cards over the course of the entire game versus both players ending the game with lots of cards in hand. I would say that those games happen as well, but they are at a lower frequency, so I would classify this as slower. Next are some sleeper picks that I like that I think you would do well to draft a little bit more. First up is Refute. This card is way better than it looks. This sort of card has historically not performed great 3-mana counter spells with a little bit of upside, but this one is really, really important in this format. Drawing a card and discarding a card is really critical because that means that in the mid game when you have those extra lands in hand, it's almost like a 3-mana counter spell that drew you a card. And there are some problematic cards that can be hard to answer that have value when they enter play, and Refute stops all of that. It just makes sure the card never comes into play, never gets your opponent value, and that is really nice as well. It also combines well with a lot of cards in blue. First up, Think Twice is a really good synergy piece with Refute for two reasons. First of all, if you are in the mid, like early turns before you have extra lands to discard, if you draw a card and discard a card, discarding a Think Twice is a really good card to discard because you'll still get to use that flashback value. It's almost like you got to cast Refute and then cast Think Twice for free. So you answered your opponent's card, drew a card, and then discarded a card. It's almost like you didn't even have to invest the mana to cast the first half of Think Twice. You just got to draw the card and then put it into your graveyard. So that's a really nice synergy as well. And the other reason it's a good synergy is if you have Refute up and your opponent doesn't cast a card that you want to counter, having Think Twice lets you still spend your mana and still advance your game plan. And then the next really good synergy piece is Spectral Sailor, or really any card that lets you activate at instant speed. Because if you're holding up your mana, once again, as we already said, you can pay 4 mana to draw a card if your opponent does not play anything worth killing, so or countering. So that's a really nice synergy to be aware of as well. Pretty much any mana sync goes well with Refute. These just happen to be two really good ones that are already in the same color as Refute. Next up as my sleeper pick is Infestation Sage. This card really just does a lot of work. If you can ever trade it for one of your opponent's cards, you end up in a good spot. So if they have like a 3/1 creature and you trade your Infestation Sage for it, all of a sudden you're up on that exchange because not only did you presumably invest less mana than your opponent, but you also are left with a lasting resource of that 1/1 flyer, which can chip in for damage and still be sacrificed to other effects or trade with other creatures and overall just be a little bit annoying for your opponent. There's also really good synergy with sacrifice effects like Eaten Alive. This is a really good removal spell. It can cost 5 mana, but if you have a card like Infestation Sage, which you're relatively happy to sacrifice because a 1/1 flyer is better than the 1/1 ground creature, then you can get a 1 mana removal spell that exiles a creature your opponent controls. That's really premium removal that you can gain access to, that Infestation Sage really levels up. And then another really good card with Infestation Sage is Arbiter of Woe. This card has really performed, really been an overperformer as well from where I thought it would be, but that card has been really nice, and Infestation Sage is perfect with it because the problem with Arbiter of Woe is you cannot cast it if you don't have a creature in play, and Infestation Sage is a very sticky creature. So even if your opponent has a kill spell, they're not going to really want to waste it on the Infestation Sage, and even if you have to chump block with the Infestation Sage, you're still going to have a creature in play, and so it just increases the odds that you're going to have a creature in play to cast the powerful Arbiter of Woe when you have 6 mana available. So those are the highlights of this draft meta update, and these are all kind of summarized here. So the archetype ranks, some top comments to keep in mind. Helpful Hunter in white has been a really good creature. Dazzling Angel has also been a really good one just for winning races, being evasive, and triggering life gain payoffs. In blue, we already discussed how good Refute has been. Big Fin Bouncer has also been excellent as a tempo play. Black has the premium removal we discussed, Bake into a Pie and Stab. Red, we already talked about how Burst Lightning was really its premium removal spell for both the early turns and the late game. That's really key and can even burn your opponent out, which is really nice. And Gorehorn Raider is another top-end threat that really works well with the attacking strategy of red and the fact that you can get a 2-for-1 with it. Llanowar Elves, as we already discussed, really good accelerator in green, and then Bite Down as some green interaction to keep an eye out for. We have the color rankings, we have the format speed. This is also available as a PDF that you can download on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. You don't need to be a patron to access it. It's just there because that's a convenient place to put input those PDFs, and also a really nice way so you'll always have access to this bonus resource. That is going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed it. Good luck in your next draft. Leave hashtag #FoundWin in the comments section down below if you made it to the end. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.